Hi, Stuart here. Part 2 of cloud logging. After I did the first video, I got a lot of comments and some emails that said, hey, you didn't really cover logging best practices. Are they the same in the cloud as they are in the data center? Let me be the first one to say yes, but I thought that I would clarify in this video. So just a reminder about logging architecture in the cloud, right? We want your app to produce happy news on standard out and sad news on standard error. Your cloud host will have some sort of an aggregator. It varies from cloud to cloud, obviously, that will also capture events and state from your host. Those will roll in as data and will end up in some sort of analytics and monitoring platform, at which time you can elect to set up automation to start waking people up, for example, or inject a ticket into your ticketing system or whatever. And the implementation details of that, I leave for another video. Lots of great content on that on Azure videos. The good folks at Elastic have good videos about that on Elk. The folks at PagerDuty, who make one of my favorite wake people up products, have great documentation on that. So I'll probably just leave them alone and focus on my thing, which is the developer experience. I was also asked to make some, not necessarily corrections, but clarifications to the logging categories. And again, what they're called is going to vary depending on your logging library. In the Microsoft universe in .NET, they are fatal, error, warning, info, debug, and trace. These correspond roughly to the ITIL and other industry standard logging categories. They may have different names, but the intentions are the same. So fatal is reserved for the application has crashed and will never ever run, no matter how many times you restart it. Generally speaking, there are very few things that cause fatal errors. In fact, I can only think of 3. It's missing critical configuration, without which it's useless. It's missing critical dependencies, so libraries, the wrong operating system, stuff like that. And third, the bytes are just fried. Bad deploy. It happens. It happens less and less often than it used to. But those are all legitimate fatal errors. Don't misuse fatal. Fatal means until humans or robots or somebody intervenes and reconfigures, reinstalls, redeploys this app, this process will never be viable. Error is you had an error and you didn't handle it, and your unit of work crashed, but my process is going to keep going. Generally speaking, it's bad form in the cloud for your process to completely abort. At the very least, it should return to its, booting fresh configuration, right? Process start with a clean slate, and at least make some attempt to restart the units of work that were interrupted. Warning messages are, we handled this error, we bypassed it, but you should probably pay attention. And notice these are not in the unhappiness path, right? Because it is a happy outcome, but it's a happy outcome about which you should be wary. So if it happens a lot, maybe you should look into it. Info is reserved for messages that are relevant to business users. Business users. So if you have a logging message that says, on behalf of customer X, we did unit of work Y, resulting in Z, that's a good info message. Other messages about the functionality of the app are either debugging or tracing messages. Debugging messages are intended to be terse. We got to here, or we did this instead of that, whereas trace messages are intended to be at nauseating levels of detail. And it's good not to mix and match, right? One test is to turn tracing off in your app and see from debugging messages if you can see what the flow of the app execution was. And then if that's then intermixed with error and warning messages, you can pretty much figure out what's going on. Trace is reserved for those cases where you simply cannot figure that out. And you need to do wholesale dumps of the state of your application or the state of your process in nauseating detail. And that is an exceptional case that you should only do for a short period of time while you're trying to figure out. Notice that debugging and tracing are normally off in production, and that the other things, fatal, error, warning, and info, are typically on in production. So that being said, I've been asked to speak about some logging numbers, and they fall into three big piles of badness. Never log security sensitive info. These are all bad, right? If someone can pull your logs and gain elevation of privilege or access to data they should not have, you should not have logged it. By the way, before people put a ton of stuff in the comments section, that Visa number, expiration, and PIN is Visa's test number open to everyone on the planet. And no, you can't buy things with it. Likewise, the checking number and account number are wholly fictitious. Don't log useless stuff. So these things all share something in common. They don't give you any useful information upon which you could make a decision. That's really important, right? The point of logging things is you see things in the log and you either conclude a certain amount of happiness about the state of your process, or you conclude what your process has been up to, or you conclude that something horrible happened and it's specific enough that you can take action. So the message, something horrible happened, not a good error message. And then finally, don't use the wrong category from the previous slide, right? Trace message, which traces off in production most of the time. Fatal configuration error, app crashes. Well, that should have been a fatal error, because that's the kind of thing you want to know about right away. Because again, the rule for fatal is my app will never restart until it is reconfigured, redeployed, whatever. By a robot or human, it doesn't matter. But the process as it is deployed is unrunnable. No logging, is very bad. I don't know how else to say it. If your app is meant to run over there, and by the way, over there could be the data center, could be the cloud, could be anywhere, and you have no logging, or you're not using a runtime that generates useful logging for you. But that's not the same. It's not as bad as no logging, but you as a developer really should be thoughtfully putting explicit logging into your code and not totally relying on the tooling. Until the tooling gets good enough that that is really useful, you should log explicitly. So we have a little C# example. By the way, my old version of this same URL was terrible. I did a bunch of bad things. I fixed it, and I also upgraded it to .NET Core 3.1, and it now randomly generates a series of sample logs, and the source code shows you how you can set things up, shows you how you can make custom exceptions, and so on, and is a much better representation. And you can see here are the example messages from the 6 categories that speak a little bit more to what is useful. Here is the revised logging demo, and you can see that we're building up a service collection and doing configure services in the same way. I inexplicably in the last demo included environment variables when this is a command line driven app, which is kind of peculiar, but it's what I did. The other thing I discovered, to my considerable annoyance, and by the way, if you figure this out where they buried this in .NET Core, there was no really good set of I hate my configuration exceptions. So I made some, and you're welcome to use them. It's all MIT, so knock yourselves out. But I use these in the demo, but I just wanted to point out that, as we said, one of the things that's legitimately a fatal error is I'm either missing a required configuration key, or I hate the value for the key that the key was there, but I hated the value. So I made 2 exceptions for that. We changed our signatures a little bit to make them slightly more .NET 3.1-y. We're injecting in iLogging factor and iConfiguration root, and we'll be using the logging factory to create 2 distinct logging streams. I wanted to show that off because that's a good practice, that you create purpose-built logging streams that will have different strings emitted into them and make them easier to dice, slice, and julienne in your log analysis tool. And I also decided that rather than emit the same logs, that I would have a little randomization, and I would emit different logs that are, I think, good examples. Of course, the actual log messages are still demo in nature, but I think for the fatal errors and the error and the warning message, I think we are a lot more clear. And obviously, when you run this, it's going to generate a random collection of errors for you to eyeball. And as always, I dump the configuration up at the top. And you'll notice that by using different iLoggers as a result of doing configuration factor.create logger, I'm able to get, different tags. So I can sort and slice and julienne these logs.